Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining. We'll start very shortly. Just a first information on how we are going to handle how we handle the Q&A. There's in the chat the link to menti.com. Menti is the internet tool that we use for you to ask your questions, and we will take all the questions at the end of the session. So please go and log to the Menti. I'm putting right now the chat in the chat the information. So there's the link and there's a code to enter. It's www.menti.com and the code is 5523319. And so please make sure that you're connected on this Menti, and there's a first question that you can answer to so that I get the info that you're logged to the Menti. Maybe we'll start right now while people are still coming in. The few words of introduction are letting them the chance to join. So welcome to this event. This is kind of a warm-up for the European Business and Nature Summit that is going to take place this afternoon and tomorrow the whole day. So welcome to this business stream. As you may know, there's also a finance stream going on at the same time on Zoom. So this is the business stream. We wanted to co-organize this event with UNEP-WCMC, the Biodiversity Consultancy, and CDC Biodiversité to be able to share the latest lessons that we learned from the first corporate measurements of biodiversity footprints. So we're delighted, and personally I'm delighted to share this event. And also I will be the timekeeper for our presenters. So the idea of the session is that we're gonna have 45 minutes of presentations and then 15 minutes of questions and answers. So questions and answers are going to be handled by Menti. So I see now that there are 6 people connected. So well done for the 6 of you. Other people, please, you can go to the chat. There's the link to menti.com. Maybe, please, Amy, if you can go to the next slide. There are the info also on the Menti. Yes. So it's menti.com. The code is 5523319. And there's a kind of a button where you can click to ask your questions. So if you have questions during the session, use this button. And also you can vote for the questions that are already asked by other participants, and then show that you're interested in these questions too. First of all, I will very much thank Amy from TBC, who is behind the scene handling all the technical stuff of this webinar, and shortly introduce the participants of the session before leaving the floor to them. So if you can go to the next slides, please. Thank you, Amy. So for this session, this first hour that I will be sharing, there are 5 participants, so 5 presentations. First one by Sharon Brooks from UNEP-WCMC on the initiatives aligning biodiversity measures for business. Then the floor will be to Xavier Houot from Schneider Electric, sharing the experience of the first biodiversity footprint assessment that was conducted this year. Then to Thomas Andro from Solvay, introducing the biodiversity strategy of the group, and then the last slot for Edward Pollard on approaches to understand biodiversity risk for companies. And then we will get the chance to answer to your questions, and the panelists will get the chance to answer to your questions. So thank you again to all for joining. Thank you to the participants for being here. There's also my colleague Patricia, who will introduce the presentation by Xavier Houot. And without further ado, I will leave the floor to Sharon for the aligning biodiversity measures for business. And I wish you a very interesting session.
Morning, everybody. Can we go to the next slide? Great, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm just going to say a few words, take a few minutes to provide you with a bit of an update on the work that we've been doing at UNEP-WCMC. So we're for those that don't know, UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, essentially a kind of biodiversity specialist arm of UNEP. And we've been leading a collaboration in recent times called the Aligning Biodiversity Measures for Business collaboration. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the work that we've done to date and our plans coming up for next year. Next slide, please. So as you know, most businesses depend on and impact biodiversity, either directly through their activities or indirectly through their supply chains. And to manage those, we need to have good, robust ways of measuring biodiversity. So as we're about to hear more about today, I mean, there has been an amazing effort by many institutions to really take these efforts forwards and to develop a whole array of different approaches to suit various needs. But what has become apparent is that there is a need to work across all these different approaches to look for greater alignment. So this is exactly what the collaboration is really aiming to do by bringing together those key stakeholders to find that common ground on measurements, monitoring and disclosure of corporate biodiversity impacts and dependencies. And then what we aim to do is to be able to feed these into these external reporting initiatives, as well as the sort of global biodiversity policy. So with the upcoming post-2020 global biodiversity framework that will be negotiated next year, how can businesses report against that, align with these sort of global policy goals, is really the aim of this collaboration. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, it is a collaboration. We're kind of coordinating it, but there are many, many partners from academia, tool developers, businesses, financial institutions, reporting agencies, and global sort of policymakers, people working in that space. And it's really been successful due to the participation of these many organisations, many of which are working with whole networks of businesses to understand the needs. Next slide, please. So what has happened so far? So to date, the collaboration has worked to convene these stakeholders through what has been what we were able to do last year through those kind of in-person workshops. Which obviously has been challenging to do lately. So the first workshop was held in March 2019, where we convened sort of 50 people that were involved in developing approaches and companies that are using those approaches. And what came out of that first workshop was a need to sort of coalesce around some key topics around how do you measure biodiversity within a business context. So the first one being around business applications and targets. We know there are different approaches, all for very many different needs. So we need to understand what are the intended purposes of all these different approaches and how they're used to set targets. Boundaries was a really important thing. What is the scope of impacts that companies are needing to measure and understand and report on? What are the baselines? What are we comparing against? Are we comparing against pristine, or where's our starting point to be able to measure change? A third one was around data sets and metrics. So these various approaches are using different kinds of data sets, some of them requiring sort of very detailed survey data, some using model data, some using proxies. What are the different data sets and the metrics to understand that change that are being used within those different approaches? And is there a sort of alignment among the different ones? And then the fourth element was really around disclosure. And this was around a lot of research to understand what is the sort of regulatory and policy trends around disclosure, what is being required in countries, what are the voluntary efforts and so on that are in place in countries to sort of drive improved disclosure of biodiversity impacts and dependencies. So all of this work then fed into a second workshop that was held in Rio later in 2019 in October, to really make progress and bringing together those stakeholders again to try and agree some sort of common ground across these different areas and topics that we focused on. Next slide, please. So this work was very kindly supported by the Boticário Foundation and led to a number of key reports that are available, and I'd urge you to go and have a look at if you're interested. So a discussion paper on identifying that common ground between the different approaches. There was a second one that looked very much at the disclosure elements and how these approaches could feed into that sort of global policy context that I mentioned around things such as the post-2020 biodiversity framework. And this all was synthesized in a report that was released in collaboration with the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform on assessing biodiversity measurement approaches for business and financial institutions, and really summarizing the outcomes of those discussions. And this has really been providing what we see as sort of that initial guidance in this space of how do you navigate the different measurement approaches that are available, and what are the recommendations going forwards. Next slide, please. So this year we've been continuing this collaboration through a number of different means. So one of them was the information that was generated around trying to look for that common ground across all the different approaches has fed into the biodiversity guidance to accompany the natural capital protocol. So this provides guidance for companies and financial institutions on how do you complete a biodiversity inclusive natural capital assessment. And an online navigation tool is now in development, which will be interactive to allow users to sort of review each action of the protocol, look for resources, and understand what is the measurement approach that can help you in your assessment. It has also fed into the Science-Based Targets Network initial guidance for business. So this provides guidance on how companies can set targets on biodiversity. And the very first step of that is how do you assess, how do you understand the impacts that you as a business are having geographically and across your value chain. So, and in order to do that, we need good, robust measurement approaches. And so there is the information from the collaboration has fed into that to try to provide a bit more insight into what measurement approaches could be used within that context. Next slide, please. And it's actually very exciting that today, in fact, we are launching a review paper, which I'm actually going to share a new link. I think that link is not the correct one, so if you click on that, it's not working. I'll put it in the chat afterwards. But we're releasing this review paper, and this is really based on, as I mentioned, the discussions that we've been having with governments and stakeholders to understand the disclosure practices from a global perspective. So where are countries at? What is mandatory? What is voluntary? And to try to provide more policy recommendations for government policymakers to help them, how can they create that step change in business action to measure those impacts and dependencies and improve performance? And so these recommendations really focus around three core areas. One is the role of governments in building that business awareness of the value of biodiversity and how it can be measured. The second is around this element of having a business relevant post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So having a framework that resonates with business, something that they can align with, that can help set their own individual targets to align with and help support the implementation of. And then the third element is around that requiring mandatory disclosure. So as I mentioned, there's quite a lot of voluntary effort in this space, but in order to really drive this forward, we need more mandatory requirements in place. And many countries are now, a number of countries are starting to take that up and lead in that space. So it's quite an exciting area. And I think that's what we're really going to need to see these kind of efforts be mainstreamed. Next slide, please. Another area of collaboration going forwards is the Aligning Measures collaboration has been working with the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform and the Trade Hub. Now, the Trade Hub is a research consortium that is funded by the UK's Global Challenges Research Fund, and many researchers there working on sort of metrics of land use change in agriculture. So we've come together to try to look at, take this sort of deep dive into biodiversity measurement within agricultural supply chains, given the very significant impacts of these supply chains on biodiversity and a significant gap in a consistent way of measuring that. So what we're doing right now actually is to have in the middle of a corporate needs assessments. What we really want to know is what is the current landscape in terms of companies with agricultural supply chains, in terms of their use, their understanding of the different measurement approaches that are available, what are their future needs, and what kind of guidance or tool development is needed to support those companies in improving the way they measure biodiversity to understand impacts. So we have a survey that is currently live that will close this week for companies. So please do participate in that survey. I can put the link in the chat afterwards. And we also have a workshop that we're planning for next week to bring stakeholders together to start to discuss how and why companies measure biodiversity and how we can move forwards in this space. So please do sign up for our workshop next week if that's of interest. Next slide, please. So this will all feed into what is the sort of upcoming next few years of this collaboration. So looking forwards, we will, from 2021 to 2024, we will be running the newly established ALIGN project, which is around aligning and counting approaches for nature, which is supported by the European Commission. So this will be led by WCMC Europe, with the Capitals Coalition, Arcadis, ICF and UNEP-WCMC, with the three objectives that are mentioned here around dedicated natural capital management accounting platform to facilitate that best practice exchange. The second one very much around that alignment of the specifics of biodiversity measurement of impacts and dependencies. And then the third one around defining those the needs around education, training. How can we mainstream these practices amongst businesses and finance institutions? So we will be bringing the stakeholders from the collaboration together to identify these gaps, looking to develop these sector-specific guidance for companies. So including building off the work I just mentioned with agriculture, but looking at some other sectors as well, and finance sector, and really trying to drive forward this idea of having this more standardized approach across businesses for how do you measure biodiversity. So we will be putting out a call to join our community of practice early next year. So we really encourage businesses of all sizes to sort of engage and provide your insights and contribute to this, because we do really want this to be a business-driven process for alignment of methods. And on the next slide, I just have the contact details of my colleague Julie, who will be running this. So do please get in touch if this is of interest. So that's a very quick, rapid run through of where we've been working, where we will be working in the future. And I very much look forward to your questions. I think in the spirit of efficiency, I will now hand over to Patricia, who I think is going to take you through the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. So hello, I'm Patricia, research officer from CDC Biodiversity. And we have had the pleasure to work with Schneider Electric on the first complete corporate biodiversity footprint assessment, which is based on the Global Biodiversity Score tool. And so now I will present briefly to you how it works, and then let Xavier further explain to you our common work. So first, the GBS is based on the MSA, which means the mean species abundance. So this this metric is developed by the PBL, which is the environmental agency of the Netherlands, and it is a ratio between observed biodiversity and undisturbed biodiversity, and expressed in percentage from 0 to 100%. So on the right, on the scale, you can see that on the top, 100% refer to undisturbed and pristine areas, such as a primary forest or natural grassland, for example. And the unit we actually use in the GBS is the MSS square kilometer, integrating the area on which the biodiversity can be measured. So it means that one MSS square kilometer loss is actually equivalent to destroying 1 square kilometer of pristine natural areas. And so this tool has been launched this year, the 1.0 version, and we account for impacts on companies and financial institutions on terrestrial and freshwater biodiversity. So next slide, I will explain to you another key feature of the GBS. So we differentiate static and dynamic impacts, and this distinction will be important in the presentation of the results. So static impacts include all the persistent impacts and the measurement of biodiversity state. So for example, the land occupied by our existing plant, which is operated by a company. And the dynamic impacts accounts for biodiversity changes, meaning for example, impacts that have occurred during the year. So it's, for example, it will include impacts caused by GHG emissions, which have been emitted by a company during the year, for example. On the next slide, so the main idea of the GBS is to link economic activity data on the left to impacts on biodiversity and biodiversity state. And for that, the GBS uses a stepwise approach to account for the best data available at each step in the company. And the data on the right, so the data are in blue in this figure. So data on the right lead to more precise and accurate results. So ideally on the right, if comprehensive ecological surveys are available, they can directly be used to calculate the MSA and measure the biodiversity state on all the plants and sites operated by a company and also by its providers. But in reality, it's hard. It's complicated to retrieve all this data for all the sites of a company. So in most of the cases, we use pressure data, such as land use changes, and this can be linked to biodiversity states and impacts thanks to pressure impact relationships from the GloBio model, which is developed by the PBL. Then companies can also have inventory data, for example, amounts of commodities or GHG emissions. And this can be linked to the impacts on biodiversity thanks to tools that we have developed and also the GloBio model. And finally, if the company cannot retrieve all this data, financial data such as turnover or purchases can be used instead and are linked to the impacts on biodiversity with the Xavier-based model and the other GloBio and the in-house tools that we have developed. And the last important feature of the GBS on the next slide is the notion of the scopes, which is transposed from the GHG protocol, so already largely used among the companies. So in the middle, in orange, you have here the scope 1, which refers to direct impacts of the operations of the company. So here, for example, the land occupied by the forest plant, or the GHG emitted by the company. The scope 2 links to relates to the energy supply, and the scope 3, in which we distinguish upstream and downstream, include all the value chain impacts of the company, so mostly the supplier impacts, for example. And for now, the scope 3 upstream is taken in account in the GBS, and the scope 3 downstream is not fully taken in account. So now I will give the floor to Xavier, who will present to you our common work. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia, and I'm very happy to be here with you all. We're very glad to have had this collaboration with the CDC Biodiversity and use the Global Biodiversity Discourse. In the next few minutes, I was asked to maybe be faster because we are already late. So what I will do is, on behalf of Schneider Electric, share with you what we accomplished and the journey in which we are to make biodiversity a more protected resource around our operations. So the next slide tells you a bit more about the company so that you understand the link between Schneider and the biodiversity. So we are global, like many companies. We have a presence across 100+ countries. And as you understand so well, biodiversity is so different from various parts of the globe. So that's one dimension. Second, we are quite a big workforce, 135 people, which can be leveraged, whose energy can be harnessed to find solutions to protect biodiversity. Also, the size of the company, and 5% in R&D means every year we spend more than 1.2 billion euros in R&D. And R&D is usually when the bill of material are defined, when we select the materials, when we decide the new technology. So there's a huge cohort of 10,000 engineers which can help us preserve biodiversity. And the last comment on this slide is on the bottom right. What we do is we help the world buildings, data centers to be energy efficient, sustainable and secure. And we are the world leader to make those buildings, assets, schools, hospitals powered by energy and safely and sustainably. And the lighter gray is on industries where we are also equipping factories around the globe with technologies. So the next slide shows you examples of what we manufacture. So we are both into hardware, software and services. Here you see most hardware, and as you can guess, as you can see, there's quite a bit of plastic. 10% of the footprint is plastic, but much more electronics and much more metals. Copper, aluminum, and steel make the most of the resource footprint of our company. So if I move to the next slide, the strategy of our company is really to really embrace environment wholeheartedly, and we have 3 pillars: climate, resource, and life. And today I will focus on that third pillar, which is the biodiversity. On climate, we already have very stringent carbon neutral commitments, 2025 in our operation, 2040, we just signed the climate pledge to be carbon neutral end to end. So we are very engaged, and we'll see how much we leveraged that effort already made to serve biodiversity. So on the third pillar on the right, sorry, which is life, it's all about avoiding chemical substance, preserving people's life, but also preserving ecosystems and biodiversity. The next slide tries to summarize how we see that as a strategic lens. Again, quickly from on the left, from our side, we want Schneider Electric to be a vibrant company, growing successfully, and that the two lines going up, so the top line and the bottom line, we want this company to be vibrant and kicking, but we want to decorrelate this company's supply chain and business from climate, resource, biodiversity. And we want to invent technologies which help our customers do the same, and help through our customers make the world cities, buildings, data centers, grids doing the same. So for that, we founded many partnerships, of which the ones I've mentioned already with CDC and their club. We also have a member of a different coalition. We are a member of Global Footprint Network for 4 years, and with Matthijs Wackernagel and team, we've been able to quantify how much we could together push the date of Earth Overshoot Day further later in the year. Would we use such or such technologies in such or such sector? So it's been central stage to our strategy for quite some time, but this time we wanted to accelerate biodiversity. I would like to skip the next slide for the sake of time. And focus on what we did. So what did we do on the next slide? First, many people ask us, hey, Schneider, you've been into this game. How much is it different from other footprints you've been doing? So this chart, all the green ticks are related to data which were needed for the biodiversity score, which we did with CDC. So on the first column, you see all the data we already had through the CO2 footprints we had, scope 1, 2, 3. So the spend, the raw materials tonnage, the energy consumption, that was there already, no issue. In external financial reporting, we had other data points, no issue. What was specific to the global biodiversity score, where we had to scratch our heads, when we had to struggle at times, where we sometimes didn't have the data, or when we had to do assumptions, when we had to know from where things were coming. Where is that ton of copper coming from? Where is that? What exactly is that plastic mix? What exactly is that energy mix? If today, for carbon purposes, we use the grid average for CO2 emissions, we had to know a bit more to be fully able to do the global biodiversity score. So this said, we were able to accomplish this work. But just the summaries on the right side of this slide, which is new data are needed and new efforts have to be done with the supply chain to be better, smarter, more precise at assessing biodiversity. So the result is shown on the next slide. So all in all, again, as Patricia was saying, we took scope 1 and 2 in the center, our operation, scope 3 upstream with suppliers, which you see is a bigger chunk of our biodiversity impact, and downstream through our customers when they use our technology. So you could go back if that's okay. Okay, thank you. So this footprint allowed us to know and to measure the biodiversity impact of our company. And as you see, it's mostly triggered by upstream, what we buy. And the scale, as you know, is, oh, can you go back one slide, sorry. So it's the scope 1 and 2, our operation is less than 1% of our own biodiversity footprint. So most of it comes with what we buy. And on the bottom left, you see out of the impact on biodiversity, 70% of our impact goes through the carbon emissions which we have through the supply chain. And therefore, any effort we do on carbon reduction will pay back twice on the biodiversity. But the gray part, which is the land use, is a specific impact which we had not measured before, which is through the materials we mine, the copper, the steel, the aluminum, and the paper or the wood we use for cardboard and packing. We have 30% of our biodiversity score. So in the next few slides, I will just tell you in few words. Yeah, sorry, the next slide. Yeah, so we did 3 actions. The first one, if you start from the right of the slide, on the CO2 side, we do many things already to be, as I said already, shrinking ourselves in our operations, in our supply chains. We decarbonize our logistics. We are going to engage 1,000 top suppliers in decarbonizing themselves. We are signatory of all these coalitions to move to 100% renewable. We're already 80% today. EV 100, all the cars to be electrical. So that's one thing which is going to serve biodiversity as well. But the next slide shows you what we did specifically for resources, which is to look at those 30% of footprint on biodiversity, which are triggered by, if you go to the next slide, by metals and wood. So that's where we are going to accelerate our efforts to be smarter at knowing where things come from. And as you see on the right side of this slide, we are committed to get 50% of our materials to be green, meaning recycled plastic, recycled metals, or low carbon power generation techniques of those materials to be able to shrink that upstream CO2 footprint and to shrink that upstream biodiversity impact. And traceability, which for ourselves can mean 4 or 5 levels up to the mine, we have to know more where things are coming from. The third type of action is on the next slide, where not only this transformation is not only a left brain top-down initiative, it's also an initiative where we're going to engage all employees and all sites. And as you see, we've floated a site policy for all of our 1,000 sites in the group to engage locally their employees, the communities, to do things for biodiversity. So the scale and the magnitude of the impact may not be as significant as the previous pages, what I was describing, but it's so much not only symbolic, but to create that culture of biodiversity preservation. We saw a lot of traction in every year's Global Environment Day on June 5th. We have a fantastic set of initiatives from our colleagues around the world, and it's something we want to accelerate with more guidance. So to conclude, if I look ahead, we have, in the next slide, if you can move to the next slide. So we have joined hands with different coalitions. The first paper has been co-developed with CDC, with Mark Go on the Capitals Coalition, and it's detailing the entire use case or case study which we did with CDC. And the paper at the bottom, which I also invite you to download from either our website or CDC website, is something we can frame with CDC and the Business for Nature coalition led by Eva Zabe. And this is something we contribute in that broader forum. So to conclude, I would like to, and before I pass the ball to Thomas in the next slide, yeah, I would like to thank you and maybe say a few words about the importance, of course, it has. It's been well said by other speakers. Climate is certainly an urgency, but biodiversity and ecosystems collapse is concerning every day. We see it in our supply chain as a threat for the ecosystems we see. So that's why I wanted to share with you and be happy to take any questions and join hands with others. I want to pass the ball to Thomas from Solvay, and who will be our next speaker.
Many thanks, Xavier, and thank you for this very interesting perspective. So hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Thomas. I am Sustainable Development Officer at Solvay. First of all, I would like to thank the organization, Biodiversity Consultancy, UNEP, and CDC Biodiversité for inviting us to testimony today. Today, the discussion is about biodiversity footprint, and there are many angles to present what we have done at Solvay about biodiversity footprint. But I have chosen two main ways to explain you what we have done. If you go to the next slide, first, I will explain why and how we use biodiversity assessment in order to inform our sustainability ambition and group strategy, so holistic approach. And then I will explain how we are using on a daily basis biodiversity assessments in order to embed biodiversity and sustainability into business decisions with one example, which is innovation. First of all, if we go to the next slide, some information on Solvay in order to understand from where I speak and who is Solvay. Solvay is a science company created more than 150 years by the Solvay brothers, and it's a science company providing sustainable solutions to many markets. For instance, polymers going to hybrid cars for sustainable mobility, clean mobility. You can have also bio-based solutions to personal care, to beauty with shampoo. So many different markets, which is important when it comes to footprint assessment on biodiversity. It's a company of 10 billion sales, globally present with 1/3 of the sales in Europe, 1/3 in Asia, and 1/3 in Latin America. If we go to the next slide, you can see that it's a company which is purpose-driven, reinvent progress, and a vision which is to create sustainable value. And for that, there is a strategy. There is no sustainability strategy, but sustainability is embedded in our strategy. And we have for that a Solvay One Planet program with sustainability goals. Going to the next slide, you can see the goals announced this year in 2020, with for the first time a target on biodiversity. So for the first time, the group take a commitment on this topic with a quantitative target to reduce by 30% the pressure on biodiversity across the value chain. So why to do that and how to do that? How to leverage biodiversity assessment in order to be able to put for the first time biodiversity at the top of the objectives of the group. Going to the next slide, you have the why. I will not come back on the biodiversity crisis. We all know that. But I will deep dive on the stakeholder expectations. At the basis of a sustainability approach and ambition, there is stakeholder engagement, how we listen our stakeholders. And speaking with them about their expectations, we see that biodiversity is a rising topic. It's the case for our customers, because biodiversity is indispensable for food security, for medicines, so for their supply. It's the case for the authorities, and we know that biodiversity is at the agenda of at the political agenda for 2020 and 2021. It's the case for our local communities locally in order to protect local ecosystems. So when you want to create sustainable value for all, you have to take into account expectations and biodiversity. And so the first question we have is, what is our footprint? What are our pressures on biodiversity in order to understand how to act? And so on the next slide, you have the model. You have first the three actions we took. First, on biodiversity, you cannot act alone. You have to understand with your customers, with your peers. So we joined global initiatives, CDC Biodiversity, CSR Europe, WBCSD. We launched a risk matrix, risk assessment locally, because biodiversity is also about local, and first about local topics. And so we assess our risks based on our location worldwide compared with the protected area. And we launched a footprint assessment across the value chain. And I would like to deep dive on that because it's key in order to engage dialogue with our customers and suppliers. So moving to the next slide, you have the model we have used based on what we have learned with CDC Biodiversity, for instance, on a business case, on a biosourced product for the flavor market. So we developed this pressure model with our R&I colleagues in order to assess all the criteria impacting biodiversity, having pressure on biodiversity. We use life cycle assessment, we use eco profiles, and the turnover for each of the products. Based on this pressure model applied for all the products in the group, more than 1,300 couple product applications, we have been able to have a first view of our pressure on biodiversity, which is available on the next slide. And you can see that more than 90% of our pressures are linked to 4 criteria: climate change, acidification, water eutrophisation, marine ecotoxicity. This is the view for the group, and we are able to provide a breakdown to all the businesses to present their pressure on biodiversity. I don't have a lot of time, so I will be quick, and I will move to the next slide. But it's clearly this pressure analysis that allowed us to discuss with the top management and to embed biodiversity in our top priorities, with this objective to reduce by 30% our pressure. By the way, it's an objective recognized as a smart one by Act for Nature, and to have this holistic view of Solvay One Planet, including biodiversity. Now I will use the 2-3 minutes remaining to explain you how we use also biodiversity assessment in order to embed that in our daily activities. And I have chosen on the next slide one example, which is innovation, because when you talk about innovation, it's about the product of tomorrow. We invest millions of euros each year on innovation. So how you are sure that you don't put €1 on one product having negative impact on biodiversity? For that, we developed, on the next slide, you can see it, we developed one tool in the Sustainable Development Team, which is used by our business for M&A, for investments, and for innovation, allowing assessment of all the products based on the impact on the natural capital. And we embedded biodiversity criteria in the indicators on the vertical axis. And we assess the use of our products. And is it aligned with the market alignment? Is it aligned with the sustainability megatrends? And we are able to do that for all the products. And if you go to the next slide, you have the examples of innovation. How we ensure that our colleagues from innovation embed biodiversity into business decision-making process. So on this slide, you have the pipe of innovation for Solvay, from the ideas coming from the market, from the unmet needs of our customers, to the market, to the launch on the market on our customers. And so for that, you can see that our teams are using on a systematic way 2 times the Sustainable Portfolio Management tool. One fast track when it's only ideas, and one full assessment when the project is going to very concrete investment. It's a way to be sure that you embed biodiversity clearly in your daily life. I will conclude in order to give time to to my colleagues, saying that this is the beginning of the journey, as explained by Xavier. We still have to scale up and we still have to raise the bar. For instance, our assessment today is based on the Scope 2 perspective. We will have to embed the use phase of our product. And it's a key challenge. We will work with that also on CDC Biodiversity. And clearly, it's a very exciting journey, but we are only at the beginning of this transformation. Many thanks for listening. I will be open to your question. And I let the floor to Edward for the Biodiversity Consultancy.
Thank you very much, everybody. This is the last presentation for this session. I'll try and keep it brief. I'm just going to give a bit of an overview, followed by a short case study. So obviously, we've heard various different case studies so far today, and what this reveals is it's a recognition of how much everything is changing very rapidly. Each month, every year, we're getting new data sources coming in, new metrics being proposed and being used by companies, and new tools available to help in this analysis. There's a little snapshot here. We've got data on the left there, from STAR to the natural modified critical habitat map. We've got tools such as the GBS, which was discussed already, and the work also that Sharon and everyone else has discussed. So there's a lot of new information coming out every day. Next. Next. I just want to take a quick step back, and just because there's a lot of different words we use, and it would be useful to just remind ourselves and get clear, what do we actually mean by a metric? And here we have a little graphical representation. So we have overarching frameworks, such as the science-based targets for nature guidance. Those to help guide and set decision-making and set strategies at a corporate level. Now, to meet those frameworks, we have a set of tools, such as the GBS tool and things like this, that help inform how well you are reaching towards the target. Those tools themselves are then built on data, raw data, often coming from various different generalized field sources, everything from, let's say, range rarity and STAR being developed by IUCN through the Hansen Global Forest Watch data, all of these vast array of different data sources that are coming out. Now, metrics, those are a mathematical representation of reality. They are a representation, an indication of biodiversity, and they are basically then this kind of adaptation of the raw data that feeds into a tool that helps you meet a framework. Next. Now, there are various different things you need to think about whilst choosing what's the best metric for your situation. How does the metric represent biodiversity? On the left there, we've got, is it representing in the top left corner, is it representing an ecosystem? Or below that, is it the tree? Is it the individual species? Or is it an entire ecosystem representing everything that's in it? Looking at threats, what's happening to the biodiversity by yourself, your own impacts, or other actors in the area? Is it, again, at the top? Are you looking at changes in the ecosystem, such as deforestation, or are you looking at individual species level impacts, such as a potential impact on birds there? So the different issues, what are you trying to look at here? Are you trying to look at a proxy representing an ecosystem and its changes, or are you trying to look at individual species and those changes? There's different ways that you might want to use. Are you looking at impacts? Are you looking at how you are meeting targets, identifying risks or opportunities, all sorts of different reasons why you might want to use a metric. Next. Now, there's sort of a way of looking at, there are trade-offs. There's always going to be trade-offs. This is, like we said, this is a mathematical representation of reality, and how you choose or how you represent reality will have trade-offs. We see there are three different main criteria here. You've got validity, it is accuracy. Are you measuring the correct things, the things that really show you what you want to know? You got completeness. Are you measuring one aspect of biodiversity or a whole range of aspects of biodiversity? And then you got feasibility. How expensive, how timely, how complex is it to do this? And you know, as you see in the little triangle there, essentially there's trade-offs between these different axes. And depending on your circumstances, depending on your requirements, what you want to get out of your metric, what your capacity is, that will help you choose which is the best of these different metrics and different approaches to use. Next. So one of the ways, and we saw this earlier on, for example, with the presentation from Patricia at the first, we can see almost all metrics in the end drop down to these sort of three different representations of biodiversity. We've got extent, how big an area is the impact. We've got condition, how degraded basically is the biodiversity within the area of interest. And then we've got significance. How important is that biodiversity? Is this globally important species and habitats, or is it widespread lower priority biodiversity? And a metric typically looks at a combination of these three different factors. Within each of those factors, there are various different considerations that can be brought into mind when choosing the different data sources, essentially, that feed into extent, condition, and significance. You can look at, well, I'll leave it on the screen, I won't go into detail, but there's always these different choices, and there's such a wide selection of data available now. It's getting increasingly easy to find the data source that fits the level of accuracy and precision that helps answer the question that you're asking. Next. So quickly run through a little bit of a case study here, another case study on top of the others. This is an example which was a particularly challenging one that we've done. We was working for a large multinational consumer goods company. Key thing that we found here was that they had a database. They provided some information with 1,000 different ingredients going into their products. So we had a big challenge to start with on how to understand these, how to find the best metrics, the best data sources for extent, condition, and significance based on 1,000 ingredients. We needed to understand what the ingredients ultimately came from. And they came from 20, broadly, more or less, it ended up actually only being about 20 different plant-based sources. Quite a revealing thing there. And essentially, like we see with our dependence on a few number of crops for food, here we can see actually big consumer goods company is reliant on about 20 different plants for most of its supply base. The data quality was quite variable. There was some good specificity for some commodities in where it was coming from and the production practices. Other commodities, much more, much less specificity on where things were coming from. So we needed to come up with a varying scale of levels of precision and accuracy for the different data sources. The best unifying metric and measure we found that could cover this wide range of different sources was land occupancy, based on the BIM framework, which was developed by CISL with support from TVC. And it captured, we felt in the end, this was the best representation of reality. It was the best met the requirements of those three different axes on the triangle. And it provided information in a clear, that was clearly additional to what the company already had, and it provided clear outputs that could help inform strategy and change. Next. So what we ended up with, to start with, we had, much like Xavier said at the beginning, we had an MSA per hectare approach. This is an unweighted land occupancy approach, which, well, perhaps unsurprisingly for those of us who follow these things, oil palm was the most significant commodity. However, when we weighted the MSA for this question of how significant the S in the BEX framework, significance, which we looked at by using range rarity, which is a measure of how much an area is occupied by rare species or species with small ranges, that elevated coconuts, because coconuts come from the tropics, often from small islands where there are range restricted species. So this was useful to see different ways of viewing the data, showing actually different ways of understanding where the company might want to make changes in their supply chain to reduce and manage impacts. Next. A quick slight change here. We also have looked at ways of doing things in a more qualitative approach, almost visualizing different data studies here from an example from South America. We've got tree cover loss, the range rarity layer again, ecosystem intactness, and we kind of come up with a way of combining them looking at different administrative units to try and give an indication of which of these administrative areas maybe have a higher or lower relative risk to biodiversity from sourcing from those regions. Final slide then, please, Amy. So our key points from looking at metrics, from applying metrics in various different scenarios is that it is now genuinely, definitely, as we saw from the case studies, feasible to assess biodiversity impacts and opportunities at scale and a resolution which really can inform decision making and make changes to the way a company operates. Let's not forget that biodiversity metrics are a simplification of reality, and that should be acknowledged. And those, and where possible, the strengths and weaknesses of a tool that's being used should be discussed and presented, so you're not looking to be hiding anything. But even imperfect metrics can drive change. We can look for the low-hanging fruit, as it were, for the easy changes in supply chains, in a footprint of a company which maybe not supply chains, but has a network of facilities with footprint. Similarly, we can understand where we can make easy changes to have big reductions in biodiversity impact. Key questions when choosing a metric: how is your biodiversity represented? Will the results be sufficiently granular? Will you have enough detail, resolution for your intended use? If that use is setting a science-based target, or if it's making personal changes against a subjective internal target. Think about your target. Does your metric actually help answer the questions? And as we say, finally, like I said before, it's useful to contextualize the results, to look at the situation, that example earlier on of MSA versus weighted MSA, to understand, well, actually, if we look at biodiversity significance, what might this mean to the results? Bit rushed. Please get in touch if you have any other questions. Thank you. Oh, sorry, no, hand over to Rose to close out and see if we can quickly squeeze in a few last questions.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you to every one of you. Thank you for these presentations. Actually, the time is a bit short to take questions directly. So there were a few questions in the Menti. What I did is that I sent a question related to mandatory disclosure to Sharon, and she will provide the answer in the chat. So you guys can read the answer in the chat. And there was also some technical questions regarding MSA and biodiversity measurements. So what we'll do is that we'll make sure to send you the presentations, all the supports, and also we will link some relevant publications from, for instance, from Schneider Electric, also from TBC, if you have some, from those of CDC Biodiversity related to the GBS. I'm currently on the Menti looking for the second questions. See if it's long or short. Okay, it's also a question to Sharon, so maybe there will be the answer in the chat. And also we'll make sure that when we send the presentation, we can also complement a little bit the answer that was given by Sharon in the chat. Unfortunately, we cannot run too late because there's another session coming. So I hope that these presentations were a bit intense, I know, but that it basically provided you some maybe new insights to biodiversity measurements, and hopefully a lot of inspirations by those examples, those leaders on the field. So stay with us for the second session, which is chaired by the Biodiversity Consultancy. And I wish you, again, thank you. And I leave the floor to Helen Temple.